Sometimes while playing Dungeons & Dragons, or any tabletop RPG for that matter, you can come across someone who brings toxicity to the game as a player or a DM, much like the person in this next D&D horror story. Be warned, it's a bit of a long one. DM and player bullies party members, cheats and metagames to look good around the table, by Reddit user Princess Arabelle. So, this is the story of the first DM many of my group ever had, and how, both as a DM and as a player, he tried using the hobby of tabletop RPGs to try and assert his dominance over his social group, leading to endless DM versus player encounters that bogged down his entire campaign, out-and-out bullying of younger players, screwing over other players' plans, and, finally, straight-up murdering a player's character simply to demonstrate that he could. This is likely to turn into a long post, as we played a lot of games with this guy over the course of a few years. And while there are too many instances of his behavior to mention, or even fully remember all of, I've tried to boil it down to 3 campaigns and the problem behavior in each. As I've seen other posts do this, let me set the scene by laying out the important players involved in the core story. We had a large group, but only a handful are relevant in this post. Names are of course changed from their originals. Kolya, problem player in question. Me, sometimes a player, sometimes a DM, mostly a player. Freddy, bullied player, who looked up to Kolya a lot, so was very susceptible to his toxicity. Virginia, another player who becomes relevant in the second part of this post. Will, a player who joined our group late in the chronology of this story, but became key in the third and final part of the post. Sebastian, DM for the campaign played in the third part of this post. Okay, without further ado, Campaign 1, Encounters. Encounters Never Changed is... Kolya was the first DM most of us had played with. I had played some one-on-one online games before this, so this was my first tabletop RPG, both in person around a table and with a group. Virginia and Freddy were getting their first taste of RPGs too, with Virginia and I joining a campaign in progress of Curse of Strahd. This campaign, as much as I remember of it, went fine. I am sure there were red flags in retrospect, but none which necessarily stood out to me at the time. There was some rigmarole where Kolya, our DM, focused a massive homebrewed side story on Freddy's character, making the naturally skittish and paranoid Freddy quite anxious about every action his character took. But this just seemed like part of the game, and the overall horror vibe of the setting. Overall, we had fun, and our experiences as a group began to bring us all closer together, so that we became friends outside of D&D. Successful first game, even if Strahd ultimately crushed us into a humiliating TPK. Maybe that was the first of the red flags. We had begun playing during the second night of the week on top of our weekly sessions, both to try different campaigns and/or different systems, and allow other people to get a shot at DMing. As a player, Kolya favored finely tuned, optimized builds that allowed him to dominate in sessions, doing everybody's jobs better than their specialized classes could do it themselves. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, beyond a few bruised egos. Power gamers gonna power game. There's generally nothing wrong with that. We certainly had no issue with him having an optimized character sheet. What was significantly more frustrating was Kolya's penchant for metagaming. He would power through any and all attempts by the party to roleplay or explore organically, saying out loud, quote, "I smell a quest giver," end quote, and barreling through scenes and locations just to get to what he thought was the next plot hook to set up the next quest and move on through the game. He wanted to win at D&D, and would passively aggressively mock other players for roleplaying and not immediately knowing where to go to advance the plot, using his in-character voice to chide our characters for being, quote, "stupid idiots," while in his in-character voice also using meta terminology like plot hook or quest giver. At one point we skipped an entire settlement because he straight up asked the DM where the plot hook was, so he could beeline straight to it, get the salient points of the quest we had to do, and zip off again with us having no other choice but to follow along in his wake. It was frustrating, especially as while we had no problems with his well-optimized builds, We were by and large a party of roleplayers, and liked getting sidetracked with NPCs and other silly nonsense that you would get up to while messing around in D&D. But this approach to D&D became amplified when he found himself back in the DM's chair after a hiatus, running a second iteration of Curse of Strahd. We had signed up to this eagerly, looking forward to a chance to avenge our first party's defeat. And to his credit, Kolya weaved in some background lore that made it clear that the first party was canon in the backstory of the game setting, and that we were very much going to finish what they started. But either tempered by his previous experience metagaming as a player, or emboldened by our group's closer friendship bonds by this point, we had been playing together now for well over a year. This was where his DMing style went off the rails. His, quote, "I must win at D&D" attitude he had demonstrated as a player is now how he approached the business of DMing, except instead of trying to win the campaign, he was trying to win against the party. More or less, there is a very important, very annoying caveat to that mindset that I will get to below. At this point, through his behavior around the table as a player, he has already sunk his hooks into Freddy, and had Freddy worn down and tormented by his teasing, mainly in-game. It got to the point where his constant degrading of Freddy's in-character decisions and actions had convinced Freddy that he was, in Freddy's own words, too stupid for D&D. Freddy was, in fact, a player whose encyclopedic knowledge of the rules was matched by his great and often hilarious role-playing instincts, and was a very creative and skilled DM to boot. But that low self-confidence had allowed Kolya to build himself up in Freddy's mind as the paragon of all things D&D, such that whenever Kolya questioned anything, Freddy was quick to back him up and claim that he was right. When Kolya suggested anything, Freddy ate it up unquestioningly. Kolya had, as one example, led Freddy to believe that mending was the most important cantrip in the game, after an episode involving a torn and thus illegible letter, prompting Freddy to make sure that every character he ever rolled up for one of Kolya's games had mending. Freddy would go to great lengths to mention that he had taken mending, as if seeking Kolya's approval. As it turned out, by design or luck of the draw, Kolya's second iteration of Curse of Strahd never once involved a necessary use of the spell mending. Freddy's broken self-esteem and submissive behavior towards Kolya was an important facet in how the campaign played out. Freddy's natural nervousness and paranoia, stoked by Kolya's constant bullying, would make him stress out of character over the most mundane details in character. We were going to a vaguely Eastern European-esque country in another plane of existence. Would it be cold? Would we need heavy coats? Cue Kolya, insisting the entire party spend 10 GP apiece to purchase heavy coats, or suffer penalties from the cold weather. We in fact later suffered penalties from being too hot because we actually wore the coats. This pedantic approach to little details swamped down every action the party tried to take. Try to open a locked door? Not only do you fail, you have to roll an exceedingly high dex save to avoid falling down. Failed that save? Well, you take 1d6 damage. And also you just bumped into the person behind you, who now has to roll the same high dex save and, oh, they fell down? Well, the next person now has to roll. And so on and so on. Thus the entire party became too afraid to touch or do anything, lest we fall victim to this kind of HP and time draining nonsense. At least 2 players lost their characters in the first sessions through this kind of pedantic nonsense. One dwarf who went prone thanks to triggering a trap kept rolling low, which the DM insisted meant he kept standing up and falling over again, taking more damage on the fall. This continued until the dwarf was literally dead, and this attitude carried into encounters too. And oh, there were a lot of encounters. After the first session of this new campaign, we had, somehow I am positive we were all only level 1 at the time, managed to kill a werewolf. There were admittedly a lot of us in the group, as I've said before. After the session, the DM called us all stupid to our faces for not dead-checking the dead wolf, claiming that it was just going to roll death saves and get back up and fight us again next time. We called bullshit on this, saying that it's not as if every monster in the game is expected to get death saves when they drop to 0 HP. While we were willing to accept that, sure, while the DM can rule that particular monsters do, in fact, get death saves, we certainly weren't stupid for not thinking of it. Since every monster we had fought in D&D at that point, and tellingly every monster we would go on to fight in this campaign, just died as soon as they hit 0 HP. There's a reason, quote, "How do you want to do this?" end quote, was our group's wink wink, nudge nudge traditional way of ending a fight. But as mentioned, Freddy by this point was so subservient to Kolya's will and way of thinking that he took Kolya's side, and lamented out loud that we, him included, were doomed to fail this campaign, because we were too stupid for what was coming. Freddy's self-esteem issues would later manifest in a toxic and dangerous way of their own, but that's very much another story. And while the dead checking didn't go beyond that single event, I suspect Kolya pulled that decision to give the werewolf death saves out of his ass just to mock us for something that wasn't even strictly in the rules. His encounters continued to bog down the game. There was no rhyme or reason to what we would be fighting, or where. To an extent, it became clear that he was just pulling out monsters he was excited to get to run. We fought a Deathclaw the week after Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes was released, for instance, but we fought it on a boat for some reason, in a raging storm on the high seas, having been transported there by a magical lake or something. Every attempt to finesse encounters, scout them out, avoid them, or find a way to gain a strategic or tactical advantage would fall flat. Kolya, after all, was DM, and the world was his to command. Thus, every plan the players ever came up with would coincidentally run into some entirely unforeseen complication, or blocker that we were just stupid for not seeing all along. Cue Freddy's almost wailing lamentations that we are just not able to handle this campaign, and we are all doomed. At the time, I grew increasingly frustrated with his chiding of the players for not being able to foresee random decisions that he as DM made just to frustrate our efforts. Upon reflection, I suspect he was well aware of how arbitrary his own powers were, and was intentionally doing it as some kind of weird, sad power trip. The encounters, meanwhile, would roll on endlessly. We'd finish up one arbitrary random encounter and stumble into the next, ad nauseum. Until at one point, I mentioned to Virginia that we had been fighting in random encounters with no forward plot progression for somewhere in the ballpark of 12 plus hours, spread across multiple sessions. And it wasn't as if these encounters added to the sense of survival horror that is supposed to permeate the Curse of Strahd campaign. Oh no, nothing so well thought out or carefully paced. We never lost resources as a result of these encounters that raised the stakes of the campaign in any significant way. We would always be restored to full resources after one of these random encounters, be it through a long rest or some NPC having some spell to bring us all back to full fighting strength, just in time for our next session-long battle. In the instances, and there were many, where the encounters overpowered us and threatened a TPK, random NPCs from elsewhere in the setting would show up to Deus Ex Machina us to safety and heal us up, so that the next encounter could begin. That's when I think Virginia and myself finally spoke up against these encounters. When it became apparent this wasn't even about the DM beating the players. He wasn't killing us. He was just dragging us kicking and screaming through these boring, pointless encounters, either because he wanted to prove he could, or simply because he was bored of the campaign itself. One final detail of his DMing Curse of Strahd that deserves a special mention are the sheer volume of nat 20s he rolled in combat against players. They were endless, and not blind either. He often made a point to roll them in front of the DM screen so that we could all see it happening. Cue, you guessed it, more distressed wailing from Freddy. At the time, we just accepted that he was getting lucky. There was a running joke in the group that Kolya could control dice, and once your friend group has acclimatized behavior as a running gag, it's hard to see it objectively. But upon reflection, Virginia had suggested to me that either his dice were loaded, or he had somehow engineered a way to fake roll to make sure it came up on the number that he wanted. He had an unusual way of rolling which involved him placing the die in the palm of his hand, and then tilting his hand to let it fall straight onto the table. No roll, just a fall. Looking back, I can't believe we didn't say anything about that at the time. As a DM now, I never allow players to get away with not properly rolling dice. Though we eventually forced this campaign to end, he started to DM what was supposed to be a one-shot almost a year later, where all the same behavior, the ridiculous character-killing slapstick saves, the endless encounters, the punishing player ingenuity, and arbitrarily ruling on why that was never going to work, etc., came to be exhibited again. We came to a decision to quietly dissuade him from ever DMing for our group again, but then COVID hit and forced us apart anyway, and his growing out-of-game toxicity eventually forced us to cut ties with him for good. So that sets the stage, I think, for the behavior that was to follow in 2 other campaigns DM'd by others in our group, myself included. I appreciate that this is a lengthy post, so if you've read this far, thanks. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments to let us know if we're collectively crazy or not for chafing against Kolya's attitude. Without delay anyway, here's the account of how he behaved when I got to DM a game. Campaign 2, Little Man with a Nowhere Plan. Eventually, I had built up enough of a rapport with this group and was confident enough to attempt to run Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition. This turned into a slow-burning disaster because of how broken the system is and how inexperienced I was DMing for such a large group of players. When I later ran a Vampire 5th Edition campaign for the same group, plus and minus a few faces, it went off a lot smoother and had a much more satisfactory ending. Kolya, for the most part, was manageable as a player. He was gracious when a ruling didn't go his way, and would state his objections to it out of character in person, but accept it in good humor at the table. A perfectly valid and much appreciated approach to respecting the DM and not causing trouble. He would even accept rulings in this way when I was clearly in the wrong and he was right. And as a result, on more than one occasion, I realized my mistake, admitted it, and allowed him the benefits of whatever rule or event he was objecting to my decision on. I can't fault him for that. He demonstrated an attitude that anyone could stand to learn as a player. V20 was a horrendously broken system with a famously badly written rulebook. So these sorts of disagreements about specific rules cropped up a lot. The problem was not so much on the meta level, but I guess the macro level. Through his antics as a player and as a DM in Curse of Strahd, Kolya had affected this god complex whereby he presented himself as a master of every game system we played. Someone who was always working the angles and always had a grand plan that would reveal itself at the opportune moment. Unfortunately, Freddy, as mentioned above, bought into this act completely and fundamentally. So much so that Kolya's persona effectively took on a life of its own as a running joke within the group. Similar to his mastery of rolling dice. Once you have made an idea like that part of an in-joke, it's very hard to get out from underneath it. This was apparently true for Kolya too, who seemed to buy into his own hype and went into my vampire campaign preparing to tear down the setting I had crafted, based on our home city, and dominate the world of Vampire the Masquerade. This manifested at first as it usually did. Kolya attached himself to Freddy's character and established himself in a dominant position over him, tormenting him both in and out of game and whittling down Freddy's already bedrock low confidence. This got so bad, in fact, that after a series of failed rolls during a bar fight between Freddy's character and an NPC, Freddy broke down a little, fretting about how terribly made his character was and how he just wasn't smart enough to play the game. He actually went quiet at the table and refused to contribute for the rest of the session. It was clear he was on the verge of tears. Myself and Virginia went out of our way to assure him that that was not the case, that the dice sometimes just do not fall the way you want them to, and I made sure that the consequences of his lost bar fight were severely mitigated. Nobody had an issue with this. Freddy was clearly upset, and I didn't want him to have to throw away a character he loved. He had worked so hard on his backstory, and had been super excited to talk through various character details with me. Freddy's character ended up in the hospital, and Kolya went to see him. Before anything could happen, 3 vampires from a rival faction who both Kolya and Freddy had pissed off showed up to attack them, causing both of them to run away. Kolya, however, always made sure to let Freddy know that he had gone there with the intent of killing his character. I cannot be sure if this is true, or just more mind games to dominate and bully Freddy. I am sure, however, that had he attempted to go through with it, I would have strictly disallowed it. It's Vampire the Masquerade. Some inter-player rivalry and intrigue is to be expected, but at my table I have a strict consent rule. You can do anything you want to another player's character, provided that character has consented beforehand. If not, you can't so much as touch a hair on their head. This issue of player consent and player-on-player aggression, in fact, would become a major issue in the climax of the Kolya story, in Part 3 below. The thing was, and this is the kicker that defined Kolya's entire experience of my campaign, Kolya was only some kind of tabletop Jesus in Freddy's mind. As a player, while great at optimizing his builds and working out the mechanical end of things, he was fairly average. And there's nothing wrong with that. I consider myself to be an average player and honestly a subpar DM. But when you're trying to live up to a persona you yourself have crafted of being a four-dimensional chess-playing Bill Belichickian super player, that's when you can start to struggle if the steak doesn't live up to the sizzle. And Kolya struggled. In order to prove he was bigger than the game world his character existed in, he had no regard for the structures of authority I had put in place around his character and the setting. He attacked powerful vampires from other factions. He betrayed the trust of quest givers and party members alike. Now, as I said, this is Vampire the Masquerade. Anybody even remotely familiar with the game setting knows how autocratic its power structures are, how tyrannical its characters, and how constrained low-level players are in how they get to operate in and shape the world around them. Very quickly, Kolya had pissed off just about every major player in the city, and was on the run for his life against every vampire faction worth mentioning. This led him to some erratic and strange behavior, as if in a bid to prove to the party that, not to worry, this was all part of his plan. Kidnapping the child of a powerful Ventru Ancilia, embracing, i.e. making vampires of, 3 random clubgoers, and then leaving them to starve in a house when he realized he didn't actually want to be responsible for 3 terrified and starving newborn vampires. He had no real plan for his characters, beyond trying to make it look as if they were working towards some grand scheme that only he could see, and that Freddy, of course, was overawed by, despite nothing Kolya did ever coming to fruition. After abandoning the 3 clubbers he had turned into vampires, he discovered that the Ventru Ancilia's coterie had marked him for death, so decided to return to the house he had left the baby vampires in, only to find it surrounded by police investigating a homicide on the site. The Ventru's child he had kidnapped, then murdered. I teed this up with room to spare. He saw the flashing lights and the police tape from down the street. All he had to do was turn and walk away. But of course, he decided he could take on a whole cohort of police, so charged the barricade and died. That was character number 1. I would later allow him to spontaneously resurrect character 1, when he similarly screwed up character 2, based on a misinterpretation of damage rules on my part when the combat encounter with the police was playing out. And it's during character 2 that the bigger problems in this campaign started. Because while Kolya had been flailing around ineffectually, trying to convince everyone that he was playing a Byzantine long-game grandmaster plan that would shock and wow us all and break my game forever, Virginia's character was actually doing something of the kind. Long story short, for those who are familiar with the game, my game was set in an anarch-free state that was crumbling internally through the corruption of the Baron and the growing influence of the Sabbat among its younger vampires. The Tremere in this setting were independent, having broken ties with the Caramilla after the Anarchs replaced them, but refusing to kowtow to the Baron. They were a powerful enough faction that the Anarchs tolerated their independence, albeit nervously. Virginia was playing one such Tremere, and had, through the course of the campaign up to this point, started to engineer an alliance between the Tremere and the Sabbat to overthrow the Baron and split the city between the 2 factions. I was impressed, and a few other players around the table began to gravitate towards the impromptu side story that Virginia had created through her own actions. And the game increasingly came to be about this dawning unholy alliance, and whether the players would, as a group, stand by and let the Sabbat cannibalize the city or stand against them. Kolya did not like this. not one little bit. After all his posturing, and after so many humiliations when his nonsensical actions failed to materialize in some kind of success, he was not happy that Virginia had gone and lucked into doing exactly that. He began to take whatever actions he could to try and hamper Virginia's plans, both through metagaming and through desperate flails that, like his erratic attempts to string together a coherent plot up to that point, made no sense and only backfired massively. His second character, an Asimite, think the Hashashin from Assassin's Creed, but vampires, basically played himself out of the game by, after completing a quest, taking a van and randomly, without any in-character motivation or explanation, driving it through the front lobby of the Tremere's headquarters in the city. I told him this would basically mean he became a marked man by his own clan. He had just carried out an unsanctioned act of war against one of the city's most feared factions, a war that his clan had no reason to persecute when they could just hand him over by way of restitution. Kolya accepted this and agreed that his character would essentially go into hiding and out of the game. By this point, he and I had discussed my mistake with counting damage for his previous character, who had gone down in a hail of police bullets. So I was happy to let that character suddenly reanimate in a city morgue somewhere and get back into the game. He still bore the weight of several angry vampires out for his head, but he was back in the game. His first action upon getting clear of the morgue was to take a stolen cell phone that had been a major factor in his previous antagonizing of Freddy, and declare that he was going to ring Virginia's character. Virginia, already pissed off about the unprompted attack on her clan's base, questioned why he would do that. For context, this character of his had had no interaction with Virginia's Tremere character. He, in proving he was above the party and the game, had gone off on his own while Virginia and the others were together being fed plot hooks. His character, in universe, had seen Virginia in passing all of once, never exchanged a word with her, and then gone off to kidnap that aforementioned powerful vampire's child. His character probably couldn't even remember her, much less claim to have her phone number. Virginia pointed all this out, and it became clear that Kolya was only trying to involve himself in her story, now that she had effectively outplayed him for best Littlefinger impersonation in the group. I disallowed the phone call, on the grounds that he literally had no in-character reason to make it, and probably didn't have her number anyway. The campaign didn't last much longer after that, as I eventually became so frustrated with V20, I effectively rage quit from the system. The players were okay with this, as by this time we had started to explore the V5 rules, and I had promised that the story would continue after a short break in the V5 system. Kolya had exhibited his game-breaking behavior on both sides of the DM screen, but what he did next is what put the group on the downward spiral towards finally ejecting him for good. I am aware how long this post is, so I'll try to keep the final part brief, which is helped along by the fact that I wasn't present for most of the final campaign, so I know most of what I know through conversations after the fact with Will and Virginia. Campaign 3, Blue on Blue. Halfway through my vampire campaign, we had admitted a new player to the group, Will. He had gotten off to a rocky start, by his own actions derailing a player's plans and upsetting them, but this was his very first time playing a tabletop game, and considering how apologetic he was when he ultimately realized what he had done, and how quickly he learned and moved on, we had accepted him, and he became as good a friend to us as anyone else in the group. That new player status proved to make Will Kolya's next obsession when it came time for us to play Pathfinder, in a pre-baked adventure module DM'd by Sebastian, the player whose character had died in Curse of Strahd due to the never-ending damage-inducing slapstick rolls. Kolya immediately began to harass and prank Will's character, using both Will's inexperience as a player and his character's naivety to bully and torment him in much the same fashion as I've described he did to Freddy above. Now, for reasons unrelated to this, Will eventually decided to switch his character out and play something more in keeping with the villainous tone of the party. Sebastian was fine with this, so Will rolled up a lizardfolk barbarian and inserted himself as a bodyguard character to Virginia's witch character, so that he could learn the complicated Pathfinder system and not have to be in the foreground where the decision-making was taking place. This apparently did not sit well with Kolya, who had effectively lost his new favorite plaything now that Will was playing a gruff, soft-spoken brute who didn't rise to provocation and generally kept his own counsel. Kolya was instantly aggressive towards Will's new character, openly admitting that he was planning on killing him, which he finally did by use of a charm person spell. As an aside, I don't know how in the blue hell Sebastian allowed this to happen. How, as DM, he didn't know what the spell did, didn't check the way the spell worked when all this started, and why, even on a meta level, he didn't simply shut this the fuck down when it became clear what was happening. But whatever the case was, as I said, I was not actually present. He didn't intervene when Kolya announced he was casting Charm Person on Will and, without sharing the rules text for the actual spell itself, explained how this allowed Kolya to convince Will's character to kill himself, which Will's character then proceeded to do, as narrated by Kolya, gruesomely clawing at his own throat until he finally died. Will was so disturbed he didn't know quite how to react. Virginia was furious. The game didn't last long beyond that session, and then COVID put the brakes on any plans we may have had to continue playing thereafter. After this, a few out-of-game flare-ups with Kolya led me eventually to disinviting him from my promised sequel to the Vampire campaign, which he took about as well as would be expected. He blocked the bulk of us on social media, and we removed him from our various group chats thereafter. The rest of us did get to play together again, when our country briefly loosened its lockdown restrictions last summer, and without his presence, we ended up having an exceptionally fun couple of games. A Vampire sequel DM'd by me, and Kingmaker DM'd by Sebastian, where we were able to focus on roleplay and inter-party dynamics. Freddy found his feet much more comfortably in the post-Kolya group, and became one of the leading lights in my Vampire campaign, cutting his own deals under the table with various NPC power brokers, and making his own plays now that the shadow had been taken off from over him. While there were other issues around Kolya's behavior, like him insisting on hosting D&D games in his hotel room so he could make creepy advances at some of the females in our group, or the time he decided that the venue we always played at, which worked for and was quite liked by everybody, was no longer good enough for him, and then got upset and stroppy when he realized nobody was going to research possible alternatives for him, and that if he had a problem with where we played, we expected him to be able to suggest alternatives. I am aware at how long this post has gone on for, so I thank you for reading this far and won't take up any more of your time. TLDR, DM and player tries flexing on group during games, relentlessly bullying a player until he's nervous and paranoid, bogging down an entire campaign in pedantic technicalities and endless encounters. Games player plans to make sure they always fail so he can triumphantly call the group stupid for not understanding his genius, tries to derail another player's character when he realizes they are playing the game better than him, and finally cheats and makes up a rule that allows him to suddenly and violently kill a player's character for not allowing him to bully them anymore. Kolya definitely seems like the type of person that would be a nightmare to play a game with, not to mention have run a game. You gotta remember that tabletop RPGs are there for everyone to have fun, and it's not just about you. And to basically target and bully a player that already has low self-esteem and may be using the game to escape reality for a bit is just unacceptable and shows your own self-esteem issues. Anyways, I would like to thank you for sticking around for the video, as it ended up being a lot longer than my normal D&D's horror story videos. If you did enjoy it, please consider rolling a crit on that like button, and subscribing and clicking that bell to be notified of my upcoming videos, cause I got a lot planned, including some deep dives into certain D&D items and some homebrew reviews. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all your rolls be natural 20s. Unless you're like Kolya, then I hope they're all nat ones.